we're going to do a sample review of just one study that validates a questionnaire. In this case, we're looking at the Short Self-Regulation Questionnaire, or SSRQ. In a South African context, one of the things that people often do is when you have an established questionnaire, they will try it in different cultures to see if there are cultural differences, or is this something that you can apply globally, right? Kind of like if you just gave it to men and wanted to know if it worked for women or vice versa. So the self-regulation, they give a little background and so on. Now, when you're looking at these, the key things to look at, one, are descriptions of this, the questionnaire or the instrument that you're looking at. Typically, you will have a copy of it, and you won't necessarily need anything else than that. You'll know what you're talking about. If you can't get a copy of it, it can often be found online, at least samples of it, or in other studies. In this case, they're talking about this study here. They have a short description. It's a 31-item self-report questionnaire, which, in contrast to the original longer version, produced a one-factor solution in the measure of an individual capacity for self-regulation. The key here is that a lot of times they will be talking about validating the factor structure, especially according to subscales. And we'll get to that later on. They will talk about their procedures, how they're doing things. If it's a good study, what you should be looking for are whether or not they are validating it with other measures of similar things. And so here they have, to determine the concurrent validity of the SSRQ, the following scales were included because of the strong association between self-regulation and psychological well-being. The 20-item Effectometer 2 was developed, and so on. They talk about the 5-item satisfaction with life scale. They talk about the 28-item general health questionnaire, the mental health continuum. Now, all of these other things or instruments are measuring something that's different than self-regulation, right? But the idea is that if we believe that self-regulation is predictive of psychological well-being, it should be correlated with the results of all these other scales. And so they go through, they talk about what they're going to do. We don't need to get into the details of that. It gets a little funky. They give some general demographics, and then they give the results. And they talk about the factor analysis and a principal component analysis in particular. This is something we talked about last week, or 2 weeks ago actually it was. And it's, pretty complicated stuff. The key thing to note, and here are their items, the means, standard deviations, minimum, maximum, and so on. What we're more interested in is the factor analysis. And so they are testing for a 7-factor model, meaning that there should be 7 distinct subscales on here. And different items should load more strongly onto each one of these factors. And so if you look at factor 7, right, you have some items that cross-load on factor 2 and factor 7 here. You have one that cross-loads on factor 5, factor 2, a little bit stronger here, so we put it on that, a little bit stronger here, we put it over here. These are both stronger here, so they get stuck over here. But that doesn't leave us with a lot to measure this 7th construct with, and we'll see what that looks like in a minute. But the idea here is that you run it through these fancy stat machines and programs and stuff, and they look at all the items and how they're related to another, and they try to figure out how the different items on the questionnaire are grouped. And you want them to be grouped according to a particular subscale structure that you identified first. So here are those Cronbach alpha reliabilities. And again, these should be really around 0.7, although that gets really complicated too, but 0.7 is something that most people are comfortable with. And you have 5 of them that high, but 6 and 7, and 7 was that one that didn't have many items of its own, and so we're really just basing off of 2 items. Not great reliability there. not great reliability here. All of these are pretty good. And so we'll talk about how we would write that up in a minute. We can also see what their subscales are. 1 is monitoring or self-monitoring. 2 is decision-making. 3 is learning from mistakes. 4 is mindful awareness. 5 is perseverance. 6 is creativity. And 7 is self-evaluation. Creativity is an interesting thing to put in this, but that's a whole different philosophical conversation. We can look at how, I should go back to this. This is how each item is correlated with each subscale is correlated with the other subscales. So monitoring is correlated with these other things, right? Most strongly with mindfulness, and that makes theoretical sense, right? Decision making, if we look at that, most strongly correlated with mindful awareness as well, and that kind of makes sense too. If we look at learning from mistakes, we see that's most strongly correlated with mindfulness. And we keep going down and we can see how things are related to one another. Interesting. When we look at this last one, self-evaluation, it doesn't have a particularly strong correlation with anything. Very, very weak correlations. And in my opinion, that should be something that's discussed. And I don't think that that particular factor should really make a pass because it's not stacking up too well to other related things. So this is the whole reliability thing. These, in parentheses, are the ones that you would be citing. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And then we have these concurrent validity studies where basically we are trying to see how this scale of self-regulation correlates with these other measures of psychological well-being. And so here are the subscales, how they each correlate, right, with psychological well-being. And you can see that some are stronger than others. This mindful awareness seems to be the most strongly correlated with psychological well-being, as does perseverance. If we look at the SSRQ as a whole, it has a very good relationship with all these other measures of psychological well-being. Of course, a correlation of 0.7, rounding this up, means that this can predict 50% of the variability in these scores, meaning that they share about 50% of their variance with each other. Down here, this goes down to around 20% only, so not as predictive, but they are measuring different things, right? One's measuring your ability to self-regulate, another is measuring your psychological well-being, in particular your general health on this one, right? So all that being said, we're going to use a 3-sentence model that makes this really easy to write when you are going through your materials. And so we might put a heading on this even called self-regulation. And that's my dependent variable if that was something that I would be measuring. I'm going to measure it using the short self-regulation questionnaire. I'm going to describe it in my first sentence. It's a 31-item survey to assess self-regulation across 7 subscales. And then I list those subscales there that shouldn't be capitalized. I might say that it measures self-regulation as well, or it's a self-report. I might put that language in there, but I don't necessarily need to. The second sentence then discusses its reliability. And so I'm going to be going through and talking about those Cronbach alphas, right? I'm going to call this reliability adequate. I don't think it's great because of that 0.5 and that 0.6 values. But the rest of them were good. And if you got rid of those last 2 factors, I think the 5-factor or 5 subscale version of this would probably be a little bit better than the full 7. But that's not something you need to worry about. You just need to cite that somebody else looked at it and report the reliability and whether it was really good, adequate, or poor. If they were all around 0.5, I would say it was poor. Finally, the third sentence is a validation description. In other words, how did it stack up against other measures of similar or related constructs? And so validation checks against other scales that measured similar constructs, e.g. the mental health continuum, short form, the mindful attention awareness scale, etc., range from 0.46 to 0.47, suggesting adequate levels of concurrent validity. So this is the general structure to use. You can use some of these sentence frames where you just kind of, your survey's name here, the number of items here, any subscales here, and so on. You could mention it's self-report or observable or whatever, but that is up to you, and it's a little bit contextual. So use this template. If you are using any published scales or surveys in your proposal, do this for each one you're using. If you are not, then I would like you to find one and do this for that and put it in your methodology just as an extra, because this is a skill that you should have. And it takes a little bit to get used to. It's hard to write these sentences at first. I remember writing something like this back in the olden days when I first started. Would take me like a half hour. It's 3 sentences. That's 10 minutes a sentence, because I just wouldn't know what to say or how to say it. But once you kind of get used to it and you get a template going, you can do it in a couple minutes and it's done. So let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing these submissions.